estamos aquí más que todo para celebrar la esencia de esos libros. La esencia de esos libros es la esencia de Colombia. Y lo que es interesante es que esos libros no fueron publicados por vender. Son regalos para cada biblioteca en el país, para cada escuela en el país. Y yo creo que es muy importante porque no solamente porque son libros importantes y todo, pero imagínense, había como a lo menos una generación de estudiantes colombianos que tuvieron que oír todo el tiempo una mentira, que el país es un país de la violencia, de los problemas. Pero ese no es el Colombia que yo conozco. El Colombia que me encanta es el país que tiene más biodiversidad que cualquier otro país en el mundo. Es el país que es el más rico a cualquier nivel de la botánica, de ecología y todo en el mundo. Y entonces estamos aquí más que todo, porque yo creo que esos libros van a tener también un efecto psicológico, porque es tiempo para entender que podemos andar hacia el futuro. Y el futuro de Colombia es el futuro de la naturaleza y la riqueza del país. So then I became a student of anthropology, but 2 years later I was tired of just reading about indigenous people in books. And I was with my roommate, also an anthropologist, in Harvard Square in a cafe, and there was a National Geographic map of the world right beside us. And I suddenly saw my friend David looking at the map. He looked at me, he looked to the map, he looked to me, and suddenly he pointed to the high Arctic of Canada, and he looked at me. Well, I had to go somewhere, and I watched my left arm lift, and had I hit Italy, I might have become a Renaissance scholar. But my hand didn't hit Italy, it went to the Colombian Amazon. And having decided to go to the Colombian Amazon, there was only one man to see, the legendary botanical explorer, Richard Evans Schultes, the man who sparked the psychedelic era with his discovery of the magic mushrooms in Mexico in 1938, but a man politically so conservative that he didn't vote for the Republican Party as an American. He professed not to believe in the American Revolution. He always voted for Her Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II. He was such an Anglophile, such a lover of England, that one of his colleagues said that the only way for Schultes to go native would be to go to London. And I knocked on his door when I was 19 years old, and I got as far as saying, "Sir, I'm from British." Well, that's all it took, that adjective. I'm from British Columbia, I've saved up money in a logging camp, and I want to go to the Amazon like you did and collect plants. Now at the time, I knew nothing of the Amazon. I had never taken a botany or a biology course in my life. In Canada, a professor would have thrown me out of the office, but this man for whom mountains have been named in Colombia, a man who won the Cruz de Boyacá, a man who in 1941 slipped away from Harvard and entered the forest of his enchantment, the equatorial forest of the Colombian Amazon, where he stayed for 12 uninterrupted years, traveling down unknown rivers, living amongst unknown peoples, all the time enchanted by the wonder of this place called Colombia. And this man looked across a mound of plant specimens through his antiquated bifocals and said very simply, "Well, son, when do you want to go?" And 2 weeks later, I arrived in Bogota, and within 3 weeks, I was on the top of a contraband ship sailing from Turbo across the Golfo de Urabá to Acandí in the Darien. And I remember I was 19 years old, and the winds had buffeted the ship all night, and then came the dawn, and I woke to this heavenly sky, of turquoise seas and palm trees to the horizon. It was like waking into a dream, and it was a dream, and the dream's name was Colombia.
Empecé en Medellín y fui con la ayuda de la Universidad de Antioquia a un sitio en el norte, en el bosque en el norte de Antioquia. Y tuvimos unos problemas porque había guerrilleros. Actually, truth is, I forgot. The first thing that ever happened to me in Colombia was I almost got arrested because they thought I was a Dutch gun runner because of the guerrillas that were there. And I got myself out of that problem. And then I went with Enrique Forero to the Chocó, came back and went to the Sierra Nevada, and came back to Medellín. Medellín was always my home in Colombia because a wonderful man, Mariano Espina Hernández, who was a jefe of the Jardín Botánico, was muy amigo con mi profesor. And so he was so kind, he gave me a room in the Jardín Botánico. And that's from there my explorations began. But I also had a room on the old road to Bogota, to Guarne, where I stayed with a wonderful campesino who had the delicious name of Juan Evangelista Roja. And his brother was a carpenter, the only carpenter I ever knew who took wind into account before he hammered a nail. And Juan's mother had died recently, and angels used to appear to him. And as he carried the coffin down to burial, they had stumbled and the corpse had fallen out of the coffin and it had crushed all these giant horsetails, cola de caballo. And Juan used to always bring manure to there to fertilize the plants so that they would never again need to feel the weight of death. And he used to say to me, Willy, in Colombia siempre fue como Guillermo, Willy. And he said, life is an empty glass. It's up to you how fast you fill it. And you're filling it far too fast. And so I had this strange combination of being tutored or mentored by Mariano Espina, one of the great orchidologists, and then spending the rest of the time with Juan Evangelista Roja. But you see, for me that's typical because I believe that nothing is a wasted opportunity. One can learn from anybody, and you can learn as much from a taxista in a way as from a professor at Harvard if you're open to the moment. Once I discovered the world of botany, my entire life changed because until that moment, a forest just appeared as a wall of green, beautiful when taken as a whole, but ultimately incomprehensible. But once I studied botany, every plant had a story, and every plant had a lineage, and each plant was related to another plant. So to look at a forest was to look at the entire history of the world, and to recite the names of the plants in Latin was to recite the names of the gods. And I think there was also something in the ability to be naked in the forest, I mean metaphorically. And for me, it was also this chance to study with those who knew the forest most. I mean, one of the fascinating things is that if I came down, as Schultes came down, to study the plants of the forest, leaves that can heal, foods that can transform our lives, plants that can take us to realms beyond our imaginings. In the end, what I came to appreciate, as Schultes came to appreciate, was that the greatest gift of the forest was a visionary realm and the profound knowledge of the indigenous people who know that forest best. So in that sense, it was an opportunity to really be born as an anthropologist and to remember the central revelation of anthropology, which is that the world into which you're born is just one model of reality, the consequence of one set of choices that your lineage made, however successfully. But the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you. They're not failed attempts at being modern. each is itself a unique answer to a fundamental question. What does it mean to be human and alive? And when the peoples of the world answer that question, they do so in 7,000 different voices. And every culture has something to teach. Every culture deserves to have a place at the council of human knowledge. And if we want to understand the forests of the Amazon, as Schultes understood so well, we have to understand the ways of the people of the forest. We have an idea that these native people are somehow closer to nature because they're más salvaje que nosotros, algo así. Nothing could be further from the truth. These individuals who share our exact intellectual capacity, our exact mental acuity, they are true natural philosophers who know what they know because they have experimented in the same way that we experiment in the laboratories of this wonderful university. They come up with hypotheses, they test the hypotheses, and they analyze the empirical reality of the world. And you know, there's no better example of that than the story of yahe, or ayahuasca. All of you, of course, have heard of yahe, the most potent psychoactive preparation of the shaman's repertoire. But to understand how yahe, its essence, you have to understand something of the shamanic art of healing. And in these traditions, health is not defined by the absence of pathogens. It's defined in explicitly positive terms as a state of balance when all components of the individual find their proper rest. Disease is defined as imbalance. And therefore, to treat disease, the origins of which always come from the spirit realm, the shaman must invoke some technique of ecstasy to soar away on the wings of trance, to get into the distant metaphysical realms where he or she can work their deeds of medical rescue. And that belief system accounts for one of the most curious observations in scientific botany. And that is the fact that of the 120 known hallucinogenic plants, 95% are from the Americas. Not because the forests of equatorial West Africa or Southeast Asia lacked powerful alkaloids or psychoactive compounds, but rather because the people there had other avenues to the divine. But in the Americas, the route to the Godhead, if you will, was always mediated by these curious plants, the plants that Schultes spent his life studying. So, and ayahuasca in many ways, or yahe, most sophisticated of all these preparations, because yahe is not a plant, it's a combination of plants. On the one hand, you have the leaves of a nondescript shrub in the coffee family, Psychotria viridis. These leaves are full of powerful psychoactive agents, 5-methoxy-dimethyltryptamine, dimethyltryptamine. These are the same active constituents that are in the vegetable snuffs used in the Upper Orinoco by the Yanomami. I'm sure many of you have seen photographs of the Yanomami blowing the powders up their nose. I've had that powder blown up my nose, and it's rather like being shot out of a rifle barrel lined with Baroque paintings and landing on a sea of electricity. It creates not the distortion of reality, it creates the elimination of reality. In fact, I used to argue with Professor Schultes that you couldn't classify this plant as hallucinogenic because by the time you were under its influence, there was no one home anymore to experience the hallucination. But the reason we're drawn to these plants is because of what they tell us about a different way of knowing. those tryptamines are blown up the nose for a very specific reason. Tryptamines, of which we have them in our body, brain serotonin is a tryptamine. The drug that facilitates communication across the neurons is a tryptamine. They are orally inactive. You cannot take them through the mouth because they're denatured by an enzyme found in the human stomach. They can only be taken through the mouth if taken with another drug that momentarily denatures the monoamine oxidase in the human stomach. Well, it turns out that the compounds, beta-carbolines, harmine and harmaline, found in the bark of the bejuco, Banisteriopsis capi, yahe, are MAO inhibitors of precisely the right sort to potentiate the tryptamines. Now, none of you have to worry about that chemistry. But think about this. How, in a forest, in a flora of perhaps 100,000 species of vascular plants, did the shaman learn to combine these two completely different denizens of the rainforest to create this biochemical synergistic effect? The only scientific explanation is trial and error, which statistically is quickly exposed as a meaningless euphemism. You ask the shaman, as Schultes did, and they will tell you the plants teach us. What does that mean? Schultes recorded in one tribal group 17 different varieties of yahe, all of which, to his eye, were the same species. He asked the shaman, the curanderos, the nature of their classification, and they looked at him like he was a fool who clearly knew nothing about botany, because any botanist would know that the classification was based on really terrific hard science. You took each one of the 17 on the night of a full moon, and each one sang to you in a different key. Now that's not going to get you a PhD at Harvard, but it's a lot more interesting than counting flower parts. It also speaks about a different way of knowing. And this is why Schultes, before I left when I was a young man, my mother was terrified. I was 19 years old. I was going to the Colombian Amazon for a year and a half. She knew she wouldn't hear from me for a year and a half, and she didn't. And so she insisted that I go by his office one more time for proper advice. So I did. And Professor Schultes had 3 critical pieces of advice. He said, don't bother with leather boots because all the snakes bite at the neck. And then he told me in 1974 not to forget to bring a pith helmet because in 12 years he had never lost his glasses. But then he said, the 3rd piece of advice, which most assuredly did not please my mother, was that I was not to come back from the Amazon without trying yahe. Then he said to me the most wonderful thing, quoting the Swiss classic scholar Paracelsus. He said, always remember that the difference between a poison, a medicine, a narcotic, and a hallucinogen is just dosage. Llegué aquí en 74 para estudiar la coca. Y the last thing Schultes told me was, in fact, something very wise. He said, there is no such thing as good and bad drugs. There are good and bad ways of using drugs. So, for example, cocaine hydrochloride, extracted in the 19th century, remains to this day our most important topical anesthetic in modern medicine, particularly for nose, throat, and ear surgery. In that sense, the pure alkaloid remains a very important medicinal drug. But coca is not cocaine any more than the luscious fruit of a peach is related to the toxic glucosides found in the pit of a peach. And when we first arrived to study coca, it was fascinating because so little was known about the plant, even though the problems that later convulsed Colombia were just beginning. Nobody knew its point of origin. Nobody knew how many species yielded the drug. Critically, nobody had ever done a nutritional study of the plant, even though it was consumed every day traditionally by millions of Andean peoples. One of the interesting things about coca, more in Peru than in Colombia, is that the efforts to eradicate the traditional coca fields began in Peru 50 years before there was a cocaine problem. What in fact happened, and it's very interesting, physicians in Lima looked up into the Andes and they saw poor sanitation, poverty, illiteracy, some social pathologies, and they had to find a cause. And because issues of poverty, economic inequity, land distribution came too close to challenging the fundamental structures of their own lives in Lima, they settled on coca. And they blamed coca for every conceivable ill of the Andes. And curiously, these same physicians never bothered to do a nutritional study of the plant, which we did in 1975. And what we found was surprising. Yes, coca has a little bit of cocaine in it, 0.5 to 1% dry weight, roughly analogous to the amount of caffeine in a coffee bean. Well, it's an axiom of pharmacology that the purer the drug, the greater the potential for abuse. If you extracted caffeine from coffee, made crack caffeine or injected pure caffeine, you would have a drug abuse problem. The first morphine addict was the wife of the man who invented the hypodermic syringe. Tobacco only became a problem with the invention of the cigarette. Lung cancer was virtually unknown until the early years of the 20th century, because until cigarettes came along, people used tobacco in pipes, so they'd cancer of the throat, cancer of the tongue, cancer of the cheek, but not cancer of the lungs. And no one noticed the irony that at every drug abuse conference, all the agents of law enforcement bolted for the coffee pot at 10 o'clock in the morning. The truth is that coca is not cocaine. And when we did the first nutritional study, we found out that that small amount of cocaine, and again, the way that a drug is absorbed is of critical importance. The most dangerous way of taking any drug is through direct inhalation through smoking, because the active compounds go directly across the blood-brain barrier into the brain. Absorbed benignly through the cheek, coca was simply a mild stimulant. We also found that the plant was full of vitamins. It also had more calcium in it than any plant ever studied by science, which made it perfect for a diet in the Andes for people who lacked a dairy product. It also had enzymes in it which enhanced the body's ability to digest carbohydrate at high elevation, which made it perfect for the tuber-based, potato-based diet of the Andes. So in one simple scientific assay that could have been readily done in the 1920s, we put into profile these efforts to eradicate the fields of the traditional people, and we showed that this was a plant that had been used with no evidence of toxicity, let alone addiction, for over 4,000 years in the Andes. And so that's why, in a way, coca has emerged as a symbol, particularly in Bolivia, también in Peru, of national patrimony, because this idea of imposing on a tradition like that, treating that tradition in the same breath that you treat the illicit use of cocaine hydrochloride is simply unjust. And frankly, I believe it's another manifestation of the terrible habit of North Americans in particular to, rather than dealing with their drug problem as a health problem, as a social problem, they prefer to export their problem to a country that never had a problem with cocaine. And one of the greatest injustices, I believe, of the last 40 years has been the suffering of Colombia because of the habits of North Americans. And the war on drugs will be seen 100 years hence as one of the greatest acts of folly in the history of public policy in the United States. The Colombian Amazon is the size of the nation of France. And it's not only an immense area of land, it is also, without any doubt, the most beautiful section of forest in the Amazon. It also may well be, according to certain studies, the repository that when climate change affects other parts of the Amazon, there are studies to suggest that for any number of reasons, the Colombian Amazon will be the last bastion, if you will, of the forest. You know, so many terrible things have happened in Colombia in the last 30 years, but always out of terrible things come some good things. And one of the wonderful things that has come about is because of the troubles of the country, development has not occurred in the Colombian Amazon to date. So it really represents probably the largest expanse of roadless forest remaining not only in the Amazon, but arguably in the world, outside of the north, with the boreal forest. This doesn't mean that the forest should not be developed. What's wonderful is that we can develop it with the mentality that we have today. And this is so important. You know, 40 years ago, we simply thought in different ways. 40 years ago, simply getting people to stop throwing garbage out of a car window was an environmental victory. 40 years ago, nobody spoke of biodiversity, biospheres. Now those words are part of the vocabulary of school children. 40 years ago, when the development began in places like the Oriente of Ecuador, eastern Peru, the Brazilian frontier, the consequences, by all accounts, have been terrible in many ways. The eastern forests of Ecuador have been riddled with pipelines and terrible oil practices. And I say that not because I am anti-oil. I actually work as an advisor to the largest private oil company in the world, a company that happens to be incredibly responsible. But what I'm saying is that now, as Colombia begins to think about the Amazon, you'll be thinking about it with the awareness and the conscience of today. And Colombia has changed in so many dramatic ways. I remember, for example, in 1974, in Bogota, the mothers of some of my friends at the Universidad Nacional would say to me, when I'd be traveling to visit the Arhuacos or the Kogi, ¿por qué quiere vivir con la gente sucio? Now, the last 5 Colombian presidents, as a first act of office, have been to travel to the Sierra to pay homage to the Arhuacos and the Kogi because they've emerged as a symbol of continuity in a patrimony that goes back for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so the whole attitude that we all have, not just Colombians, towards the medio ambiente gives us such strength and possibilities as we now have the opportunity to address the question, what do you actually do with this vast forest? So that to me is incredibly optimistic. And whenever people ask me if I'm pessimistic, I reply that if you're a father, you know, pessimism is an indulgence, just as despair is an insult to the imagination. You know, if you think about it, in the last 40 years, women have gone from the kitchen to the boardroom. People of color have gone from the woodshed to the White House in the United States. Gay people have gone from the closet to the altar. What's not to like about a world where such dynamic transformations can occur? And we've also been very fortunate, all of us, to live through 2 moments of scientific revelation that will be spoken about 2,000 years from now. The first occurred on Christmas Eve, 1968, when Apollo went around the dark side of the moon. And for the first time in human history, we emerged to see not a sunrise or a moonrise, but an earthrise. And in that instant, we realized that the planet was not a flat, limitless horizon. It was, as the astronauts famously said, a blue orb floating in the velvet void of space. And that moment created a shift in paradigm that we will be talking about for 2,000 years. The second great revelation also came about from a great scientific journey, but a journey not into space, but into the very fiber of our beings. And over the last 20 years, geneticists have proven it to be true, something that philosophers always hoped to be true, and that is the fact that we're all brothers and sisters. And I don't mean that in the spirit of hippie ethnography. I mean studies of the human genome have left no doubts whatsoever that the genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. We are all cut from the same genetic cloth. Race is an utter fiction. We're all descendants of a handful of people who walked out of Africa 65,000 years ago, embarked on this incredible journey of 2,500 human generations, 40,000 years that carried us to every corner of the habitable world. But if we're cut from the same genetic cloth, we share the same genius. And how this genius is expressed is simply a matter of choice. That old Victorian idea that there was this ladder of success that went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized of London has been exposed as an artifact of the 19th century, as relevant to our lives today as a notion that clergymen had then, that the earth was only 6,000 years old. Science has proven the interconnectedness of humanity, and what that tells us is that every culture is but an expression of the human heart, of the human imagination. Everyone has something to say. And the sad thing, or the tragic thing, is even as we've come to embrace this new revelation, which was always the message of anthropology, we've come to recognize that of the 7,000 voices of humanity, the 7,000 languages that were spoken the day that you were born, half aren't being taught to children. Within our lifetimes, half of the intellectual, spiritual, psychological knowledge of humanity is being lost before our eyes. And this doesn't have to happen. And remember that a language is not just vocabulary and grammar. A language is a vehicle through which the soul of a culture comes into the world. Every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an ecosystem of social and spiritual possibilities. So to lose half the languages in a generation is to lose half of humanity's patrimony. And this does not have to happen. And how do we make it not happen? To recognize that the choice is not between the traditional and the modern, but rather to ask ourselves what kind of world we want to live in, and how do we find a way that all ethnic groups can benefit from the genius of the modern without that engagement having to demand the death of their ethnicity. That matters because culture matters. Culture is the glue of civilization. Culture is not about feathers and bells and prayers and songs. Culture is about a body of moral and ethical values that we place around each individual to keep the barbaric heart that lies in the essence of all of us at bay. It is culture that allows us to make sense out of sensation, to find order and meaning in the universe. And when you lose culture, you create chaos. And the chaos of the world is a consequence of the loss of culture, because culture is the glue of civilization. So how do you keep culture? You keep culture by recognizing that everybody has something to say, and the idea then isn't the traditional versus the modern, but the rights of free people to choose the components of their lives, which is exactly what Colombia has done in a way that no other nation state, besides perhaps Canada, has done. So in the northwest Amazon of Colombia, when President Virgilio Barco said to Martín von Hildebrand, do something for the gente indígena, and Martín, with the president's support, put aside areas of land the size of the United Kingdom for 57 ethnicities and encoded that in the Constitution of Colombia in 1991, that secured the future not only of those ethnicities, but the future of a pluralistic democracy that is Colombia. Because when the nation state realizes that indigenous peoples do not threaten its integrity, they enhance it if that state is prepared to accept diversity, which Colombia has shown itself prepared to do. And that's precisely why Colombia, it's yet another reason why Colombia, to my mind, remains a true beacon for the world.